All right. Welcome to Getting the Most Out of Minor Scales by Ralph Martin. Today we're going to talk about the four minor scales that are derived from the major scales. If you haven't looked at the video that I did previously on the major scales, I highly recommend that you go take a listen to that first because a lot of patterns that I use there will be used here. But I'm going to talk mostly here about how the minor scales come from the major scales and exactly what they are. So let's dive right into it. Okay, so these are the topics that I'm going to be talking about. First, I'll talk about the C major scale. Now realize that this applies to all the major scales, not just the C major scale. But I use the C major scale as a point of reference. If you need to know about all the other major scales and the keys, there are plenty of videos out there that'll tell you all about those. But if you really want my take on it, leave me a note and I'll try to do a podcast on it. But today I'm going to show you the major scale again. Then I'll talk about how the natural minor scale is derived from that. Then I talk a little bit about the A major scale and how it relates to both the harmonic major scale and the melodic major scale. And there's two different styles of melodic minor scale, both the classical style and the jazz style. Then I'll talk about the triads from the natural minor scale, the triads from the harmonic minor scale, the triads from the melodic minor scale. I'll talk a little bit about some practice patterns and some optional patterns. In the description below, I'll leave links to both the PDF for this podcast, a PDF for the practice patterns, and a PDF for the optional patterns that I'll talk about too. And I talked about that in my previous podcast, but I'll talk about it again. Okay, now here's the C major scale in stepwise motion. Now, what is stepwise motion? That just means moving up the scale one note at a time. We're not skipping any notes. We're not jumping around at all. We just take it step by step by step all the way up the scale and all the way down the scale. Now, in all these examples, I'm only showing or most of these scales, I'm only showing it up and down in one octave. But of course, you need to do this in as many octaves as you can, or the complete range of whatever instrument you play, whether it be bass or a treble clef instrument, doesn't make any difference. But the first degree to the scale, we call the tonic. It's called the root, or just the first degree of the scale. But most of the time, we talk about tonic or root. The second note is called D. Is called the second degree of the scale. The third note E is called the third degree of the scale. The fourth note F is called the fourth degree of the scale. The fifth note G is called the fifth degree of the scale. And the sixth note A, now this is very important, so remember this particular note, is the sixth degree of the scale. The B is the seventh degree. This is also called the leading tone because it leads us to number 8, or the tonic, or the first degree of the scale, or the root. It leads us to C again. Now, why is the sixth degree so important? Well, we take the C major scale, and instead of starting it on the root, or the tonic, which is C, we're going to start this scale on the A, and you'll see what I mean on the next slide. Now here's the A natural minor scale in stepwise motion. Now you see this is the natural minor scale, which means it stays in the same key as the major scale it was derived from. Now this is called a relative minor. Now, what does that mean? Well, relative, like having a brother or a sister, means that it's got exactly the same key. In other words, the C major scale is the relative major of A minor, and the A natural minor scale is the relative minor of C major. See, it goes back and forth. They both share exactly the same key, which is no sharps, no flats in this case. Now, since we're in minor, the A becomes the tonic, the first degree of the scale. The B becomes the second degree. It's no longer a leading tone, it's just merely the second degree. The C becomes the third and not the tonic anymore. And the fourth degree D is the fourth degree. The E is the fifth degree. The F is the sixth degree. The G is the seventh degree, and we're back to the tonic again. And now you see it just goes backwards all the way down. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's the A natural minor scale in stepwise motion within one octave. Again, work this up on your instrument as far as up you can go, as far down as you can go, and then back to the tonic. Memorize these. They are so important, especially if you want to do any kind of improvisation or you want to do any kind of song in a natural minor, which there are plenty of. You're going to need to know the scale. Why? Because it eliminates 5 notes out of the chromatic scale. And it gives you just 7 notes to work with, and it gives you an idea of the tonic, of the root, of what is always back to home. Okay? So work on these natural minor scales. Okay, now here is the A major scale in stepwise motion. This is exactly the same as the C major scale, except it's the A major scale. Now, why is this important now? Well, I want you to pay particular attention to the 6th degree and the 7th degree of the A major scale. The 6th degree is an F sharp, and the 7th degree is a G sharp. So you need to remember these, okay? Because we're going to be using these notes. We're going to borrow these notes from the A major scale. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. Okay, now here's the A harmonic minor scale in stepwise motion. Now you notice right off the bat that there's a difference here. We have a G sharp. Now this is not normally a scale that's necessarily used in a melodic sense. Most of the time it's used for a harmonic sense, in other words, for chords. And what does this do for us? Well, it gives us a dominant chord. In other words, the 5th chord is major instead of minor. And on the next slide, that will become more apparent. So just be aware that the harmonic minor scale has a major 7th in it. It has a leading tone. Remember from the natural minor scale, it was a G natural. Now we're going to borrow that G sharp from the A major scale to make a dominant chord, which the 5th chord, make it what's called a dominant chord, and becomes E major instead of E minor. And you'll see that more next slide. Okay, now here's the A harmonic minor scale, but this is the chord motion out of that scale. Now you see we have an A minor tonic chord. an A, a C, and an E. Okay, that's the tonic chord from the A harmonic minor scale. Now you see that the fifth chord, which is an E, in the in the A natural minor scale, that would have been an E minor, E, G natural, and B. But because we're borrowing that G sharp from the A major scale, it turns into an E major chord, which is called a dominant chord in this case. So now we have E, G sharp, and B. In this case, the E is on top, the B is on the third line, and the G sharp is on the second line. What that gives us is that you see how on the bottom the A goes to the G sharp, and then the G sharp leads us stronger back to the A. It's a stronger motion than the G did. So that's why this was developed. It's a much stronger motion going A minor, E, A minor. The motion back from the dominant to the tonic is much stronger if it's major rather than a minor dominant. I hope that makes sense. If not, leave me a question. I'll talk about it some more. Okay, now here's the A melodic minor scale in stepwise motion. Now this is the classical style. Now remember back when we were looking at the A major scale, I said remember about the 6th and the 7th degree both being F sharp and G sharp relatively, right? So here we have an A, a B, C, D, and E, all the same as the natural minor scale. But now we're going to borrow the F sharp and the G sharp to the A. Now the reason we borrow the F sharp and the G sharp, because they work better melodically. When we went from an F natural to a G, it was a big leap. It was very, very hard to hear. And it didn't sound very good. So in order to we still want that dominant E, and we need that G sharp, but to make the melody work better, we put in an F sharp. So it goes E, F sharp, G, A. But in classical style, they didn't want that on the way down. And the reason being, we have a G natural, and the F is only a half step away from the E, which is, again, a dominant note. It's not the tonic, it's not the root, but it's a dominant note. And the F leads to the E much stronger than the F sharp did. So they used an F natural on the way down. And then all the rest of the notes are exactly the same. Now, this is a classical style, so if you play any classical music, you're going to hear this a lot. Matter of fact, if you happen to know Bourrée by Bach, which was redone by Jethro Tull, he uses this exact scale. Go listen to it. Now, Jethro Tull does it in D minor, but the original was in E minor. Go listen to it. You'll hear it. Now, jazz players didn't necessarily like that motion. They liked the fact that the scale up and down worked the same for them. Now, usually this is used for a minor major chord. In other words, a minor triad with a major seventh on it, like an A minor major 7, A, C, E with a G sharp for the 7th. So jazz guys improvise with an F sharp and a G sharp both going up and going down. So this is why I say there are 4 minor scales, relative minor scales, to be practiced. Okay, so let's move on to triads now. Okay, now one word of caution before I get into the triads: make sure you memorize all four of those scales in all keys, all the way up and down your instrument. Do it with the various patterns that we'll talk about at the end of this podcast. You've really got to get these under your fingers. And I'll have a podcast coming up that talks about what chords go with what scales and what scales goes with what chords in what situations, which is called chord scales. And I'll be doing that later. But for now, just realize that scales actually go with chords in certain situations. Especially, you need to know this if you want to improvise. Okay, so A natural minor scale, we're going to talk about the triads. Now remember, we're in the no sharps, no flats, A natural minor scale. The first chord, the one chord, is a minor chord. The second chord is a diminished. Now why is it diminished? Because it's B, D, and F natural. That's a B diminished triad. The next chord is the C major, the third. The fourth chord is the D minor, because there's no F sharp, strictly D minor. The fifth chord, which I've talked about before, here's the E minor, the dominant chord. It's the fifth chord with a G natural in it. So it's an E minor chord. The sixth chord is an F major. The seventh chord is a G major. And we're back to the tonic. So this is how those triads move up and move down. Now again, you need to know these by heart, and you need to know how to play them on your instrument following the patterns that I'll give you at the end of this podcast. Now here are the chords at the A harmonic minor scale. Now I won't say they're ugly, but they're kind of unusual. And that's why you don't normally see a piece strictly stay in an A harmonic minor scale. It might move into it and then move out again. We start with an A minor, and we still have a B diminished, but the C, the third chord, becomes an augmented chord because of the G sharp that we borrow. Now, sometimes if I were playing this melodically, I would only put the G sharp on the E and not for the rest of the scale. But for sake of theory, we're going to use an A harmonic minor scale throughout this whole piece. So the C becomes an augmented chord. We still have a D minor, and here's the E major, the dominant 5 chord. The F is still major, and the G becomes G sharp diminished. G sharp, B, and D are a diminished triad. And the 1 is back to minor again. So they're not chords, especially the diminished and the augmented chords aren't normally used in melodic chord progressions. In minor chord progressions. Okay, now here's the A melodic minor scale triads. Now again, some of these chords are unusual, let's say. We have an A minor chord. Now the B becomes minor, which is not bad. And then we still have the C augmented chord. But now the D becomes major. The E is still the dominant, and we have an F sharp diminished 6th chord and a G sharp diminished 5th chord. Now, kind of the problem with this is that if we use a D and an E a lot, it's going to sound like we're in A major, but all of a sudden we go to an A minor chord. It kind of sound kind of strange. So again, this melodic minor scale is used melodically, not necessarily as a minor progression. Okay, so here is the practice patterns that I was talking about. Now, this is a PDF that I'll have down as a link in the description below. And these are the different ways that you can practice these scales. Now, I talked about this a lot in the C major podcast that I did, and there'll be a link to that. Please go look it up if you haven't watched it. But we talk about the scale in just straight stepwise motion, all the way up, all the way down. And then we talk about doing it in thirds, every other note, up and down. Then we talk about doing it in fourths, in other words, C to F, D to G, E to A, etc., etc. Then we have the fifths motion, in other words, from 1 to 5, 4 to 6, and as an example, we go from C to G, D to A, E to B. Then we have the sixth motion. Now, when we start getting up into these higher leaps, higher intervals, sixths to sevenths in the octaves, you don't necessarily see them as a regular melodic device. You see them as a leap somewhere, but you won't see them as necessarily as a pattern, although they could be. I'm not saying you can't do it. You might see more of this in like some of the bass motions, especially octaves. But then for the sixth, we go C to A, D to B, E to C, etc., etc. The seventh degree, C to B, D to C, E to D, and on. Now, I'm just talking major, but this applies to minor also. And then the octaves. Let's go back to minor then. A minor, AA, DD, CC, DD. Now, the diatonic triads. In the example given, the diatonic triads, you just play the triad all the way up, all the way down, and then move on to the next one, all the way up, all the way down. Do it as far as you can on your instrument. Don't worry necessarily about time, but try to keep them even. But some of them are going to be longer than others because on your instrument you might have an instrument that has shorter octaves than others. Okay? Now, the diatonic triads that are broken, you're playing every other note. 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, etc., etc., all the way up and all the way down. Scale in diatonic triads. Now, this is where you'll play just the 3 notes of the triad and then move on to the next one. Now, usually you take this in 2 beats. You can do 2/8 and a quarter or a quarter and 2/8. But you'll do this, again, all the way up your scale and all the way down. Hopefully you can get through all the chords at least once. Then you do the scale and diatonic triads in quartet motion. Now, what does that mean? It means that you do 4 notes from the triad. Now, you can do it 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, and so forth. You can do it that way. Or you can just do it in 1, 3, 5, 1, then move on to the second note, and you go 2, 4, 6, 2. Does that make sense? If you look at the sheet from last week, the PDF from last week, you'll see how it makes much more sense. Then the diatonic triads in triplet motion, you're going to do 3 notes within one beat, and you're just going to do 1, 3, 5. And then you go to the minor, the second chord, like in this case, a B diminished, and you do 1, 3, 5. And then a C major, 1, 3, 5. And then a D minor, 1, 3, 5. And E minor, 1, 3, 5. From the A natural minor scale. Okay, so that's how to do these. If you do all of this, you will truly have your major scales and your minor scales under your fingers. It seems like a lot of work, and it kind of is. Start slowly and work it up. And after a while, this will become second nature. It won't be hard to do at all. But all this comes in play when you start playing these kind of minor songs. Now, the last slide, or second to last slide, whatever. Optional scale motions. Now, you're going to find that you're going to do these patterns. Typically, they'll be ascending and then descending. And it's very typical to do, especially when you're doing something like thirds, fourths, fifths, etc. It's almost natural to do it that way. Now, what I mean by ascending is that if in A minor, if you go in thirds, A, C, B, D, C, E, that's ascending because the second note is always on up. Okay? It's not going down, it's going up. Then when you get to the top, a lot of people do C, F, G, E, F, D. Now that's descending. That means that the second note is down. But what you could do, what I call ascending, ascending. Now that means on the way up, you still do C, E, D, F, E, G, etc., etc. But on the way down, you do A, C, G, B, F, A, E, D. See, the second note is up. You're still going down the scale, but the second note is ascending. So I'm talking about the second degree or the second interval of the pattern. You with me? So then, like I said, ascending, descending is the most natural one that most people learn, but you should be able to do the other one too. And most people don't do the scale going down, ascending. Then you could take this pattern and flip it around. You do a descending going up. In other words, you do A, E, B, G, C, A, D, B, and et cetera, on your way up, which means that the second note is descending. The second note goes down. And then on the way down, the second note is still going to be up. So it's A, C, G, B, F, A, E, D, et cetera, et cetera. Then you do descending, descending. In other words, the second note is always lower than the first note. A, F, B, G, C, A, D, B, etc. on the way up. And on the way down, you go back to A, F, G, E, F, D, etc. I hope that makes sense. Take a look at the optional patterns from the major scale PDF that I put out last time, and you'll see more in depth on exactly what I mean. If you need me to go more in depth on this, leave me a note, and I'll go more in depth, and I'll talk about this, and I'll show examples of exactly what I mean for all the scales. Well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation of getting the most out of minor scales. Please subscribe, hit the notice button so you can hear when I put out more podcasts. I hope this was helpful information to all you musicians, both beginners, intermediate, advanced, and anywhere in between and above. This is Ralph Martin signing off. I hope this helps. Please leave me a comment. I would love to hear from you. If this helps at all, or does it make you more confused? Do you need more explanation? Do you need less explanation? If there are any topics you would like me to talk about, let me know. Let me know what topics you want to talk about. I have a list of things I want to talk about, but you put it in the comments, maybe I'll bring it up a lot sooner. So everyone, be well, take care, stay healthy, be good, be happy. And goodbye for today.